In the time allotted me, I can't begin to do justice to the illustrious career of our speaker. Rachel Bronson is, pardon me, is executive director and publisher of the famous Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which inter alia publishes the famous Doomsday Clock. She served for 8 years at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs in a number of capacities and taught global energy at the Kellogg School of Management as an adjunct professor. She has served as senior fellow and director of Middle East Studies at the New York Council on Foreign Relations, as senior fellow for international security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and adjunct professor at Columbia University. Rachel Bronson is an author and prolific commentator, a frequent witness and consultant, director on numerous boards, and recipient of many honors. It's my honor to give you Rachel Bronson. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Everyone can hear me okay? Good. Congratulations on starting exactly at 2 o'clock. I looked down and like the second hand, I care about second hands, the second hand had just hit 2. So I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming out. I'll say it's really gratifying to come out and talk about something, what I think, and we all do, is this important, this urgent, but really at a Sunday at 2, everybody has a ton of things to do. And so that you carved out time to come and talk about this really is gratifying and helps us and my team kind of do what we do every day. So what I thought I would do is just start today with a little bit about where we are. The fact that on January 24th, we moved the Doomsday Clock from 3 to 2.5 minutes to midnight. Talk a little bit about the Doomsday Clock itself, and then try to run us up very quickly to the present. The temptation would be to walk you through every clock change since 1947. I promise I won't do that to you. We'll very quickly come up to the present just to situate ourselves for how we got to where we are. Talk about the change, and then some of the critiques that we've heard, and then hopefully end up with what we can all do to move those hands back away from midnight. So we moved it, as I said, from 3 to 2.5 minutes to midnight. It's the closest it's been to midnight since 1952, when we moved the hands to 2 minutes to midnight, or we moved it actually in 1953, but in response to the hydrogen bomb testing of the United States and at that time the Soviet Union. That's the closest it's been. And it's the first time, the furthest it's been is 17 minutes to midnight, which was in 1991, was after the end of the Cold War, when the US and the Russians were very promisingly in negotiations to begin to reduce our nuclear arsenals, which they did significantly. So it's the first time it's been this close, and it's the first time that we moved the clock 30 seconds. So why did we do that? And as background, why we did that was we have a statement, the statement's on our website, but we made 2 very important statements, that words matter and expertise matters. And that words matter because we're right in a political campaign where there was a sense of, well, you know, just the president says a lot of things, so who knows what he means. But what he's been saying is, I'm a man of my word, and I think it's really important that we keep him to his word, because it seems even in the past few weeks that his words do matter as we thought they did. The other thing that we said was that expertise matters. So there's a temptation, of course, as we know and we hear, to say everyone can do all of this on the fly. And what we believe, and I think those of your room believe, is you won't go to a heart surgeon who had been a plumber and then say that, okay, give it a try. That when we care about things, we want that kind of expertise, and that expertise around big science and technological issues that will affect the future of the planet seems like a time where we should take that into account pretty seriously. And we wanted to make that statement that it was that important. Now, so we move for those two reasons. And again, but back to words mattering. I moved a little quickly on that because there is a temptation very much to focus on the words of the president. And we were very clear that we take the words of the United States president very seriously, because between the United States and the Russians, we maintain 90% of the nuclear weapons on this planet. And so those are the two countries we focus a lot on. You'll see we obviously consider other countries as well. But it's not just the president. So over Christmas, it was around the 23rd or 24th of December, the foreign minister of Pakistan issued a very aggressive tweet in which he was responding to fake news put out about the Israelis. And the fake news was that the Israelis had made certain threats. And in response to what turned out to be a false news story, the foreign minister of Pakistan tweeted that the Israelis should remember that the Pakistanis are a nuclear country. So there's very loose threats being made at a time around issues and weapon systems that are very dangerous. And in a time when we need predictability and need to understand what's happening. So it's important to focus on our president, but we're in this moment where it's very casual. And so we highlighted that too, because we're in this environment where talk seems to be very cheap, and in a world where we know, in a realm where transparency and clarity are very important, we're very concerned. So what is the Doomsday Clock? Let's just start a little bit on that. The Doomsday Clock is a metaphor, is a symbol, and it's probably the most powerful artistic representation of the 20th century. So a graphic artist, Michael Beirut, has called it the most iconic piece of art of the 20th century. And to me, it's also the most powerful example of what we can do when art meets science. So it was created in 1947. June will be literally the 70th anniversary of the Doomsday Clock. And it was the first cover of our first magazine, as simple as that. The Bulletin started in 1945, 2 years before, by scientists at the University of Chicago who had worked on, or actually had gone off to Los Alamos and been part of the Manhattan Project. They had seen the testing, or knew those who had, and they had witnessed the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they immediately came back and said, the world as we know it has changed. We need to find ways for scientists to engage the public and policymakers, but we also need to bring others with us. If it's just scientists speaking, we're not going to get our word across. And so they literally created a 6-page black and white bulletin of the Atomic Scientists of Chicago to begin to send out their findings about what had changed. And it became so popular that they turned it into a magazine. That was the time of Life magazine and Time magazine, and so the Bulletin was going to become a magazine, and to do so you needed riveting and beautiful covers. And so one of our physicists, Alexander Langsdorff, turned to his wife, Martil Langsdorff, the famed oil landscape painter of Chicago, and said, can you do something for us? And she created the clock. And it was set at 7 minutes to midnight to convey urgency, nothing more urgent than a clock ticking down from 7, and also to play off of the notion of a countdown, which was so familiar to those following kind of nuclear policy. And so the urgency of really midnight being the apocalypse, the end of the world as we knew it, or the end of humanity as we knew it, and that urgency. And so that became our first cover. And when asked why she said it at 7, she said, because it looked pretty. It's that simple. She had the artist's eye. Anything further didn't convey urgency. Any closer, I don't know, maybe helplessness. But she's bounded us to that starting point of 7 minutes to midnight. And then very soon thereafter, 2 years later, the first editor, Eugene Rabinowitz, who some of you may have known, moved it closer to midnight, and there began the dynamism of the Doomsday Clock. So who decides the time of the Doomsday Clock? It started where it was really Gene Rabinowitz who did it, and he, in talking with his friends. What we've done now, and since his passing, how it's been done, is it's the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin. So we're now a group of you can go on our sites and see who we are. It's that board. We have 3 boards. It's too many, but that's another legacy. But it's the Science and Security Board. Experts in nuclear security and nuclear waste, experts in climate change and emerging technologies, and we'll get to that. That's a newer addition to our clock that we'll talk about shortly. But it's the board that sets it. And they ask 2 very simple questions when they come together every November. We're in conversations throughout the year, but we come together in November to set the clock, and then the statement is written to be released in January. And so they come together to answer 2 very simple questions. Is the world safer or at greater risk than it was last year? And compare to history. So those are the 2 questions that we really talk about, which is how are we doing compared to last year? And then stepping back, knowing the history of movements, what do we do at that time? So I will tell you, we had thought we would actually move it backwards a year ago in 2016. We would move it away from midnight coming into 2017. We didn't. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then a little bit on why we do it in January. And the reason we do it in January is it's a culmination of the year before. So we could very easily set it at the end of December and get that big end of year bounce that newspapers and magazines do. But we don't, because the reason that I'm very determined that we set it in January, and I think my predecessors would agree on this, is that it's aspirational. If we set it in 16, it's a culmination of the year before, and it's kind of set in stone, and oh well or oh good, that's the way it was. By releasing it in January, I think it puts a challenge out to all of us that next year at this time, we have a year, let's move it back. And there's actually something that we can do about it rather than seal that book and put it away and start again in January. So the timing of that is very important. Okay, so in 2010, in 2006, we added climate change to the issues that we focus on. So let me explain why, because it'll give you the sense of what we think we're about, and then turn a little bit to the recent times. So we added climate change in 2006, and the reason we did, and this was about a 10-year battle about whether or not we should, is the bulletin itself looks at, and if you can look at our past journals to see that the science and technological advancements that could change life on Earth as we know it. And in 1945, there was one scientific advancement and then one technology that could do that, and that was nuclear energy. It had the ability to destroy the planet and to electrify it. And that's what was so interesting about it. And it was going to be up to us to decide which one we were going to do. And quite frankly, we haven't figured out how to electrify it yet safely and securely. But if we could, we have a carbon-free energy that has the potential to electrify the planet and not destroy it. So there was one technology that could do that in 1945. But the members of the Bulletin could see what was coming, and there's this beautiful quote from Gene Rabinowitz, and my team's so tired of hearing it, but it's so beautiful. And what he says, he's asked, like, what's the purpose of the Bulletin? And he talks about nuclear risk, and he talks about the need to get rid of nuclear weapons and make this a safer planet. But then he goes on to say, it's about managing Pandora's box of modern science. And to me, that really captures what we're about. And the modern science in particular, we would never use that term today. But I think then he understood that science was going to advance so quickly that it was just going to throw up more of these issues, that we could tackle this big one, but it wasn't the only one coming. And sure enough, in the 50s, you can see writings on brain development, early work on climate change coming in the 50s. By the mid-70s, we had a cover story on climate change, or global warming, greenhouse gases. Is the same physicists and people who were compelled by nuclear energy. Many of them were hiving off and now seeing the second issue that had the potential to change life on Earth as we know it. And so that became the debate for the board. Is this a nuclear organization or one about science and technological advances at this big existential issues? And they voted on the latter, which I think is actually where we should be. And so what we look at when we set the clock is nuclear risk, climate change, and emerging technologies. Emerging technologies, advancements in biology, cyber, artificial intelligence, none of those have affected the clock change yet. Basically what we're saying is we're looking at these and keeping our eye on it. But it's these two others. Are they apples and oranges? Absolutely. Are they different timescales? You bet. But if you want to answer the question, is the planet safer or at greater risk this year than it was last year, it doesn't make sense unless you're considering those two issues. So that's what goes into the clock change. Okay, so I told you I'd spare you the run-up from clock changes from 47 to the present, which I will. If you're interested, we have great graphics on our website. Go check them out. It's a very concise, and probably I should have passed it out. Sorry for not thinking about that. We had a very big clock change in 2015 that we released for the 2015 time that was released in January of 2016. And I kind of want to start there to run us up to why it's 2.5 minutes to midnight now. So a really big change happened in January of 2016. It was our 2015 clock statement where we moved the time of the clock from 5 to 3 minutes to midnight. And why did we do that? Because that lays the foundation for this recent change. The first was the real deterioration in U.S.-Russian relations. And I mentioned these two countries maintain 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So deteriorating relations between those two are very troubling. And what we're watching is an increasing return to nuclear rhetoric by both countries. We saw this from Donald Trump in the campaign, but we've seen it even earlier from Vladimir Putin, who is talking about who the Russians have integrated the use of nuclear weapons into their battle plans. He talks about them regularly. There's maneuvers around their nuclear arsenal to let us know that they're practicing on how to use them. And this was a departure from what we had seen in the past. And so that deterioration plus the reinfusion of nuclear politics is something I think we need to be very worried about and take very seriously. And again, during the run-up to the election, where it seemed like our candidates didn't even really know what the triad was. It's okay if your neighbor on the street doesn't know what the triad is, but it's the foundation of the American arsenal. And for the commander-in-chief not to know that was very troubling. Now, one thing I would say about Donald Trump, because it's come up a few times, he's actually been interested in nuclear weapons for decades. We actually did there was a very interesting piece in like Vanity Fair or something like that. I can pull it up back in the 90s because Donald Trump had the idea of how he was going to solve the nuclear problems. And he was the kind of a guy in New York. And so there was this article, and they used Bulletin articles to as supporting documents for the article they wrote about him, and he had this very bizarre, he could fix it, we know that now from him, and how he was going to get the Libyans to give up theirs, and but it's not, this is not new to him. He's actually been thinking about it. That wasn't conveyed by him not knowing what the triad is, and I don't, quite frankly for us, put a lot of stock in it. But it wasn't like he just woke up, decided to run for president, and started thinking about nuclear weapons. He's actually been thinking about how he personally could make everything better, although the plan, as far as I read it, was a little zany. So the move from 5 to 3, a real concern about what's going on between the U.S. and the Russians. Then more specifically, a real concern about modernization programs that are happening in every nuclear state in the world. And so we'll start off with the United States, because it's the one that we have the most control over, really, which is the United States is about to embark on a $1 trillion 30-year plan to modernize its nuclear weapons. Now, all of us in this room, and I think anybody who looks at it would agree that some money should be put into keeping our arsenal safe and secure. So a modernization program that did that upgraded some of the deteriorating command and control centers, that brought in modern technologies, I think we would all want and be very supportive. $1 trillion over 30 years is a very different ballgame. And for those who look at it carefully, looks like the recreation of an entirely new arsenal that brings us very much into the 21st century. This is a big investment that's being made. And it's not being made in a vacuum. It's being made in response to the Russians, who are investing very heavily in their nuclear arsenals. It is being made in response to India and Pakistan investing heavily in theirs. Pakistan has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal on the planet. We know about what's going on we see what's going on with North Korea in terms of their testing and their clear commitment to using nuclear weapons as a piece of their foreign policy. So there is and China is investing in its own nuclear arsenal as well, particularly in submarines, and being very clear that they will always be able to respond. So the U.S. decision is not being taken in a vacuum. But it is certainly keeping up with what's going on. And then I think for many of us who would look at it, is adding new and advanced technologies that makes it very hard to say that we are seeking disarmament. Now, why is that important? Why is it important to be seeking disarmament? Because the principal arms control agreement that really is the kind of foundation for how we think about nuclear stability is the NPT treaty. It's signed under Nixon in the early 70s. And what that says is very simple. Well, when boiled down, it's very simple. It's that countries that have nuclear weapons will try to get rid of them. Countries that don't have them won't try to get them. And that everyone's entitled to peaceful nuclear power. That becomes very important in the Iran deal, right? How to make sure they can have nuclear power. That's not the precursors to them seeking nuclear weapons. So everyone has access to nuclear power. Countries that don't have nuclear weapons won't try to obtain them, and those who have them will try to get rid of them. Well, if we're embarked on this program of modernization that looks like we're actually reconstructing our whole fleet to be a new and shiny nuclear arsenal, it's hard to argue that we're trying to get rid of them. And that's why, and now that I say it, if you're not seeing it, you'll see it in the newspapers now, there's this movement among non-nuclear states to create a ban the bomb movement, to come together through the UN to try to make having nuclear weapons illegal. That's a good thing. That's a lot of countries trying to get rid of it, but it's a bad thing because it seems unlikely to work. It will further divide those who have and those who don't, and it kind of sets up another kind of battle at the United Nations where all nuclear power countries are probably likely to say, we don't support that. But it puts yet again more pressure on this NPT, which actually has been very stabilizing. And the whole architecture is really kind of archaic at this point, and it's not keeping up with the current events, and to have more pressure put on the NPT is probably the last thing that we want to have happen. So we're concerned with U.S.-Russia relations. We're concerned with modernization of nuclear powers. And we are concerned about the breakdown in global consensus and action around nuclear issues as well as climate change. So again, this was 2015, where climate change was and is a major issue. We didn't see any global action being taken around it. There seemed to be a lack of seriousness in addressing it, and a real call from our science and security experts to pay more attention to global responses to these challenges. So that was 2015. Being mindful of time. In 2016, we came out with a statement, again, it's all on our website, that it was still 3 minutes to midnight. And we weren't sure how that would play. That's not really a newsy headline. It's still 3 minutes to midnight. So we but what we said was, that's our headline. It is still 3 minutes to midnight. But we followed on with, and that's not good news, which was we didn't want to move the clock because we had built in all those issues, but nothing had really changed. And it was and is a dangerous time. What we have found with the clock is that it the news of the time spreads around the globe like nothing I have ever seen before. You heard the bio, I've spent my career working in foreign policy. I've been a think tank. We all try to figure out, how do you rise above the noise? How do you get your message across? This doomsday clock is like nothing I've ever seen before. It's easy to understand, and it galvanizes a conversation. And the conversation it galvanizes, which I love, I think some of my predecessors were a little bit more nervous about, but what I love is, did we get it right? Are we right about the time? And are we including the right things? I love the debate about whether climate change should be included. What else should we be included? How would you change the time? And that's the conversation that happens around the globe. It stops the global conversation for a day. And we might say, well, only a day. For a day, we stop and think about the planet. And that framing then pops up throughout the year in so many different places, on posters and science fairs, to framing of UN conferences. It framed a bill that went onto the Scottish Parliament's floor. It's a frame that can say, it's 3 minutes to midnight, what are we doing? And it's used, and it's used, and it's used. So in 2016, we said it's all the same, but we held out 2 points of hope and optimism that I actually thought we would use to move the clock back in this time around. And what those were was the Paris Climate Agreement and the Iran deal. So I just want to spend a little time talking about those, of why, because certainly the Iran deal was a very big kind of and contentious deal here in the United States. We didn't move it because of those, because actually Paris hadn't happened yet, but the experts could anticipate where it was going. So we didn't move it from that. But why we had optimism about it was that this was the world coming together. This was what we had been missing in 2015 and what we had been calling for, of coming together and saying climate change is an issue that we can make progress on if we work together. And it was an innovative set of commitments, or lack thereof, that countries were beginning to bind themselves to. So what came out of Paris was non-binding commitments, right? So there's a lot to criticize. Every country looked at what they thought they could do and put out there and said, we think we can do this. So you could criticize the Chinese, and a colleague of mine did at the time, by saying, you know what, they made commitments, they're already on track to get rid of coal for air pollution. Some of the things they're doing, they're going to do anyway. It's not really self-binding. It's not really kind of what we think about as a treaty. But they put it on the table, and the United States did too, and that was a big deal. And if you got the United States and China making those commitments, it did compel others to put it out there. Now, the not so secret about those commitments is, even if everyone lived up to their commitments, you still wouldn't stay within the 2-degree Celsius change of the planet that was the goal that had been set out. If we could keep the Earth's temperature from rising more than 2 degrees, we would have considered that a success. And these commitments, the scientists didn't think would actually get us there. It would probably get us more to 3 or higher, and who knows, it's a science, but there's room for debate. But it didn't look like it was. So was it really that important? We said yes, it was. We thought yes, it was a step. It was a step in the right direction that we could build on. So it hadn't happened yet when we came out and said it was a bright spot, but we anticipated where it was going. And the Iran deal, very similar logic. On the Iran deal, we came out and we didn't move it because it had been signed but not implemented. And so we said it's going to really be in the implementation. We were very optimistic about what it could achieve, but we had to see to make sure that all parties remain committed, particularly the Iranians. And what we saw over the year, by and large, was commitment to what they had signed up for, which completely took the experts by surprise at how much the Iranians agreed to do in terms of containing their nuclear program. So particularly around the production of plutonium, put an end to that. There are challenges, there are downfalls of that agreement, like any, but our experts were arguing this is beyond what we expected, and our goal now is to spend the next 10 years finding ways to bind the Iranians to this agreement so that as some of the provisions in it begin to expire 15 years hence, 20 years hence, we've made progress in convincing them that continued commitment to this arms deal is in their interest. And we have 10, 15, 20 years to do that, depending on what you're focusing on. And that was significantly better than being on the precipice of a year to breakout, which is basically where they were when the deal was signed. So a fun fact about the Iran deal that I find just truly amazing is part of what made it so technically successful is that you had the chief negotiator of Iran was a PhD from MIT in nuclear energy who had worked with our Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, as a PhD working at MIT on nuclear energy. But what was particularly interesting was it was the Iranian negotiator, Salehi, who demanded that he would not negotiate unless he had Ernie Moniz at the table. Because he understood if he was going to give something up, he wanted to make sure the United States understood that. And he wasn't going to do that if he had, kind of good-hearted diplomats there. So he wanted a PhD from MIT on nuclear physics at the table who also happened to be our Secretary of Energy. And the two of them could come to technical agreements that they could then sell to the foreign ministers or Secretary of State who could make the deal. And what was so interesting about it as well, and there was a wonderful piece by David Sanger in the New York Times. It was below the fold and didn't get as much press as it should have, but it was front page, where Sanger lays out how Ernie Moniz, Secretary of Energy, had the lab directors. Argonne was there and Oak Ridge was there at the table. And the Iranians would come to them and say, okay, we're going to get rid of this and this is what we're going to do. And that way you can be convinced that we're actually making progress in getting rid of our nuclear program. And so they say, okay, great. And then they'd send it out to the lab. And out in our deserts, we have a mock-up of the Iranian nuclear facility where they would actually test it. And then they'd come back to Moniz and say, no. They say that this is what's going to happen, but this is actually what's going to happen. It's not good enough. And then they'd go back to the table, negotiate again. Quite fast. I mean, it gives you such hope when we're at our best. There's so much that we can do. So those were the two bright spots that we said, and we had this debate in the board in 2016 where they said, no, we want to wait. We don't want to move the clock away. Let's wait to see if what happens at Paris happens like we thought, and let's wait to see if the Iran deal is implemented. And so that's what we thought we'd come into in 2017. And indeed, you did get those commitments, and we have seen the Iran deal implemented. But the election and the election campaign and everything where we started kind of took hold. And we're not so convinced that the Iranian deal will continue, both because we're not really convinced of our commitment to it, so we don't feel as bullish about it anymore. And we don't feel as bullish about the Paris agreements, given who's going into our cabinet and the statements being, who's going into key positions in American cabinet, and the statements that have been made. So we can't feel good about that. And then we came into this place where we saw this recklessness around the words being used, of words mattering, we believe, and the dismissal of expertise in terms of making those decisions. So rather than move it backwards, we moved it forwards. And we moved it forward, though, 30 seconds because we wanted to also be clear that actions speak louder than words, but that words matter. So we had never moved it 30-second increment. We've always moved it in increments of a minute. And it would have been very easy to move it to 2. And there was some discussion of doing that. But when we really thought about where we were and the message that we wanted to convey, the 30 seconds seemed more appropriate. Because we've always moved it on actions, disarmament actions. We've always moved it on signings of treaties. We didn't see any of that. But we just felt we were going in the wrong direction, and that the 30 seconds conveyed that something important was happening, but to be mindful that actions speak louder than words, and actions can be taken to actually move it back. Okay, so that brings us up to today, a sobering conversation on a Sunday afternoon. So what's the critique of this, and then what can we do about it? And hopefully we'll end up a little bit more motivated than demoralized. The critique, I know, I'm like the worst person to invite to a party. And you can imagine, like I'm picking my kids up from school and they're like, oh my gosh. So what's the critique? The critique is that we're just being partisan, right? We come out, a Republican president, he's out. I heard it on so many talk shows, that's everything we got. It's just partisan, it's just this liberal organization who wants to get rid of nuclear weapons. You get a Republican in and we move the clock forward, and you get Obama and you move it back. Not so, we say, not so. We've moved the clock forward and backwards just equally for Republicans and Democrats, and in fact Republicans have signed a lot of these agreements in which we've moved it backwards. And that indeed we did move it backwards when Obama came into power. Because he, as you may recall, he went out to Prague and he made this very important speech in 2009 calling for the end of nuclear weapons. He organized 4 summits around it in Washington, D.C. There was great hope. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in part before it. And he and Medvedev at the time were on the cusp of signing the most recent arms control agreement of 2010, the New START, which significantly committed the United States and the Russians to reducing our arsenals, which we're in the process of doing. So this was a very important time. And it's something, we have a museum exhibit actually opening at the Museum of Science and Industry on May 25th, looking at a lot of these. And one of the things is, when was the last arms control agreement signed? And we expect that everyone will say 1972, 1979, maybe end of the Cold War. 2010. It's so recent, right? So that should give us cause for optimism. Different time, but there was an ability 7 years ago to put the US and the Russians on track to reduce their arsenals, and we've been doing that. Now, it's been in the news recently because you might have heard that Putin called the president to ask whether or not he'd remain committed. We're coming up to a period of renewal in 2018, and whether the president would remain committed to that, to which the president said no. So it's in the news. It's worth watching. It's worth asking our political leaders about, what are they going to do about this? Are we really going to let this expire? And but it was an important time. So we did move it back from that, but we also in 2015 moved it forward 2 minutes to midnight because of decisions the president was making in terms of the modernization of our arsenal for reasons that we can talk about, go into domestic politics. In order to get that New START 2, he committed to the modernization of the arsenal, which we think is extremely destabilizing. And we heard it from the administration. They were not happy with us. So we moved it, yes, back. We moved it forward. So in terms of being partisan, we don't think that really holds up. Too soon to tell. The president had been in power 3 weeks, and we kind of came out with the statement, absolutely, absolutely. But again, he had set us off on a course. We were taking him seriously. He's now repeatedly said he's a man of his word, and so we felt very comfortable doing that. And as I had said, we had issued that statement every January. That was something that was partisan. He was only, that's when we do it, and we do it for that reason. This is what the new administration faces. And they face this year in 2017. 4 years earlier, it would have been 2013 when we would have had a similar statement. And then the third one, which is very interesting to think about. Apparently, the president and Vladimir Putin are very good pals. If they can use these very close relations to turn it to the good of the country, this would be a great place to do it. So rather than saying no to that phone call, if he's trying to get himself out of hot water for all of these seeming ties to Russia, if he could turn that around and use that for the good of this country, that would be a phenomenal opportunity. So what about that? So our view is fantastic. Show it to us. Let's do it. There is a moment. If he's got anyone thinking strategically up there, and there's a big if, this would be a great way to use it. So, yes, there's incredibly solid and strong relations between the two. Here's a place where they can actually demonstrate it. Jury's still out. I think we're all a bit skeptical, but here's a place where he can begin to change the narrative if he wants to. Okay, so what can we do about it? You know, these issues are always so far away, and we all care about them so much, but it seems really hard to do anything about it. And I was just sharing with Nancy as I walked in today, you know, the traffic to our website is going through the roof. We're getting a ton of interest. I was telling Nancy, it's very actually exciting. It's a very small silver lining on a very dark cloud, but we have about 160,000 people now coming to our website every month. Half of them are under the age of 35. And half of them are from outside the US. And half of them are inside the US. And it's growing. It's growing in leaps and bounds. So we're really proud of that. So we know there's a lot of interest out there. And I had said to a board member, you know, kind of off the cuff, well, I guess people care about this now. And she stopped me and she said, they've always cared. They just thought someone else was in charge. Right? We all thought, like, okay, I can park this one, the president's on it, right? He made a speech in Prague and he's taking the country to Paris, like I can focus on other things, and here we are again. So what we're all learning is we can never take these things for granted, that somebody's, you know, got a handle on this. And I think that's why we're seeing the traffic and the uptick, to get smart again on what the key issues of the day are. So what can we do about it? Modernization. This is a bread and butter issue, $1 trillion over 30 years. We can ask our representatives of what they're doing about this. How are they fighting on this? This is a lot of money. We're talking about all the things that this country needs. So how are they making sure that the money is going to the right place? Is this really the right place to be spending $1 trillion over 30 years? And we have very receptive representatives, but this is a good thing to ask them about. There's a bill going through that Markey and Lou are sponsoring, and it's about no first use. It's about the fact that the president shouldn't be able to initiate nuclear war on the offensive without an act of war from Congress. This seems really reasonable, right? Now, absorbing a strike, there's a problem there too. But it gets a little bit more complicated. If there's news that we're about to be hit, a president will have 6 to 10 minutes, 6 to 13 minutes to make a decision. Makes it a little harder. I still think we can figure this out, how it's not one person. But an offensive strike, to say you got to have a declaration of war from Congress, seems in a democratic country something that we should sign up to. It's easy to sign up for that. Plowshares, if you go to plowshares.org, any of the organizations, there's a big petition, put your names on it. It's very important. How to protect the Paris Climate Agreement. And I was talking to our climate experts on this. They said something to ask your representatives is not, do you believe in climate change or not? It's, what are you doing? What are you doing to help manage climate change? There's a whole bunch of small and big things they can do, but make sure it's on the agenda. What we know is that most Americans actually believe that climate change is happening. It's just that other things take higher priority when they're talking to their representatives, which makes sense too. Don't let it make sense. Make sure somebody asks about it. What are you doing? Keep it on the agenda. The Iran deal, same thing. We think this is a good agreement. What are they doing to try to preserve it? This thing is under heat, and it's from our side. It's not from the Iran. Well, the Iranians aren't making it easy, but we don't expect them to make it easy. They are living by the commitments of that deal. So what are we doing to make sure that we continue to patch the holes and the gaps in that agreement, which are similar to so many other agreements? What are they doing? What are they doing to ensure that that stays in place? And finally, we need the best and the brightest again on these issues. The advancement of science, the Pandora's box of modern science. How do we make sure that our kids and the next generation remains as committed to managing the advancement of science? I was on the red eye last night. I was just coming from Phoenix, where there's a big conversation on artificial intelligence, and they filled a theater, over 1,000 kids at Arizona State University, who wanted to think about what do they need to care about in terms of artificial intelligence and these emerging issues to keep this planet safe and secure, so that we can benefit from science's greatest achievements by managing its risks. So motivate all that you know to get engaged in these kind of issues. And with that, I think we can take questions.